Welcome and good evening. My name is Chase Robbins, and I'm the interim president of the Graduate Center, and I'd like to welcome you to what promises to be an illuminating evening, the inaugural event in the Graduate Center's year-long exploration of New York's creative economy. As many of you know, the Graduate Center is a school of arts and sciences. It's a center for applied and theoretical research, and it's a platform for performance, for conversation, and public debate. As a community of students and scholars committed to the unconventional idea that learning is a public good, we regularly offer public programming featuring eminent thinkers, cultural leaders, and distinguished artists addressing some of today's most pressing problems. To that end, we are delighted to present Cultural Capital, the promise and price of New York's creative economy, year-long institution-wide public programming that'll explore the city's creative and knowledge-based industries through an array of conversations, panel discussions, screenings, and performances. I encourage you to visit the initiative's website at gc.cuny.edu/culturalcapital to attend many of the year's events and to join us as we seek to understand the forces shaping our city. In particular, I'd like to call your attention to our second major event this fall, a program on December 2nd, What Are the Economics of the Creative Economy?, which will feature economist Edward Glaser, former president of New York City's Economic Development Corporation, Seth Pinsky, NPR's Adam Davidson, and the Graduate Center's own David Harvey, who, as many will know, is really the world's leading thinker in geography. Please do mark your calendars. Now, the city has long been a greenhouse for the cultivation of the creative economy, from music to publishing to theater to arts institutions of all scopes. Tonight, we've convened a distinguished group to explore New York's enduring centrality to the country's creative industries and to try to answer the question, what is the current state of New York's creative economy? First, we're delighted to be hosting Jonathan Bowles. Mr. Bowles has been executive director of the Center for Urban Future for the past 3 years, and during his tenure, he's been the architect of the center's policy agenda, turning it into one of New York's most influential think tanks. As the author of numerous policy reports, he's written about the city's tech startup scene and the impact of immigrant entrepreneurs on urban economies. It's also our pleasure to welcome Elizabeth Currid-Halkett. Professor Currid-Halkett is associate professor at the University of Southern California's Price School of Public Policy, where she teaches courses on economic development and urban policy. In addition to her books, The Warhol Economy, How Fashion, Art, and Music Drive the New York City, and Starstruck, The Business of Celebrity, Professor Currid-Halkett has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, and many other publications. We're also honored to have New York City's Commissioner for Cultural Affairs, Kate Levin. Commissioner Levin directs cultural policy for New York City, supporting and strengthening nonprofit cultural organizations through public programming, technical assistance, and advocacy. Prior to her appointment, Commissioner Levin taught at the City College of New York, worked at several New York City cultural organizations, and served in the Koch administration. Finally, it is my pleasure to introduce the interim chancellor of the City University of New York, Bill Kelly, who will serve as our moderator. Prior to taking up his current post in July of this year, Chancellor Kelly served for 8 years as the president of the Graduate Center. A distinguished scholar of American literature, he's chairman of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation and the City University of New York Research Foundation, and he's published essays and reviews in a broad range of publications, including the Times Literary Supplement, the New York Times Book Review, and the American Scholar. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests.
thank you, Chase. Thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to be home, wonderful to be on the stage with these distinguished panelists. The mandate, as I understood it from President Robinson, was to talk about the current state of New York's creative economy. But I'm trained as a cultural historian, so whenever I'm asked a question, my instinct is to historicize the question. With that in mind, I'm always going back and forth here. With that in mind, I'd like to ask Kate to start for us and to please take us back to the state of the city's creative economy in 2002 when you started in this job in January. My sense of this, a difficult time. We're in the wake of 9/11. Cultural institutions are in some distressed state. Your budget, again, if memory serves, was like every other city agency and department cut. What was your vision in 2002 for cultural affairs in the city, for the creative economy? And how has that vision played out across your 12 years in this office?
Well, I guess I'd say a couple of things. In terms of the amount of feedback I'm getting, is that better?
Everybody here?
Okay.
Great.
Anyways, thank you. Yes, 2002 was an extraordinarily difficult time for all kinds of industries, including very much the public sector. A lot of conversations about audiences. Would people come into the city to see work? Could school children go to arts education programs? A lot of questions around how this whole industry would survive and continue to thrive. It's a sober thing to reflect that actually this administration's gone through two major boom-bust cycles in the past 12 years. So, 2008 was in some ways more insidiously traumatic because it was an economic meltdown that in many ways was generated by the sort of tax epicenter, the revenue epicenter of the city. So, it's been an interesting journey. But what I would say is, in terms of the city's creative economy, I think it's a phrase that requires perhaps more nuance than it is often accorded. Right. I think what the mayor's vision has been is that this is really about content, and that New York's preeminence will always rest on the degree to which the best ideas, the most innovative and thoughtful kinds of communities are created here. And arts and culture has obviously a very important role to play in that. New York is the biggest college town in the United States. Part of the reason students keep coming here, even if they're coming for bioscience, is because there's a great jazz club down the street. Yeah. So it's part of that larger kind of ecology. But also, when at a time of globalization where you can work anywhere, why do businesses choose to locate here? It's all part of that same topic of quality of life. And that's really a term that the mayor uses a lot in trying to think about the disposition of public resources. And again, culture, which might not rise to preeminence under a different kind of vision, really does in that set of perspectives. So I think following 2002, the mandate was really to figure out how to help this sector stabilize, how to help it become a player in the larger diversification of the city's economy, which was essential. And how, again, do you continue to make New York a friendly and welcoming place for all kinds of people from all kinds of cultural traditions? New York has been 40% of New Yorkers have been born outside the United States. That statistic's been true for over 100 years. So, part of what arts and culture serves as a way of validating all kinds of different traditions. But literally the day he was inaugurated, he said that he wanted to do the Christo and Jean-Claude project, The Gates. Yeah. So I'll just end with saying it, we got it together in 2005, and that was, I would say, a pivot moment in the post-2002 history of New York, because it was really the first time, I would argue, that New York was on the front page of every kind of news outlet all over the world for something that had nothing to do with tragedy, disaster, politics, money, ad hominem attacks on anyone. And it really did project an image of New York as a place that was open to creativity, open to whimsy, welcomed different kinds of discussions and debates, was willing to run the gauntlet on a bunch of very different kind of stakeholder issues, and try and produce and create something that was absolutely public and absolutely rooted in extremely dynamic cultural traditions.
And conditions that were driven by decision and investment. City commitment to the arts, it's a larger budget than the National Endowment for the Arts, larger budget than any city in the United States, and a commitment to making these things happen that is astonishing, because the decade before 2002, not a terrific decade for the Department of Arts, of Cultural Affairs either. So to see that happen has been a remarkable achievement for those of us who are committed to what happens in the arts in the city. Jonathan, your career at Center for Urban Future overlaps a good deal of Kate's time at the commission. What's your sense of the last 12 years, particularly building it around the Bloomberg administration is convenient for this conversation, but you've been writing reports. There's an extraordinary report in 2005 looking at the creative economy. Your group is one of the first to really identify that as a critical term and concern. 2010, after the fiscal turndown, another report thinking about the ways in which the real estate downturn could be utilized in the interest of the arts and culture community. What's your sense of the trajectory of the last 10 or 12 years in this city?
Well, like everything else in New York, it's complicated, but I think the biggest thing is that, you've probably heard, or a lot of people in this room have probably heard, that New York has outperformed the rest of the nation economically over the last few years, during the recession and since the recession. And I think one of the reasons is the importance of the creative economy in New York. So, if anybody's been paying attention, Wall Street has been stagnant or declining for a decade or more. The legal services industry, another really critical linchpin to New York City's economy, also losing jobs over the last 10 or 20 years. Other key sectors, similar things. But if you look at the numbers over the last 5 years, all of these creative industries have really been carrying the day. So everything from fashion and film to advertising, really huge growth over the last 10 years. So all of those industries I just mentioned, up over 20% in job creation over the last 10 years. I just noticed, I looked at the numbers today, the film industry in New York, every year going back to 2004, there's been more jobs than the year before in New York City in film and TV. And I think that, so we did this Creative New York report in 2005, and I think if anything, creativity has just gotten more important to New York City's economy. I think on the one hand, we're living in a creative economy globally and nationally, and New York is a place where a lot of people that are creative, that are artistic, they want to be. They want to be around other people like them, and so New York continues to be a place that's attractive to do art, to do creative things. Creative industries have really, I think, if anything, kind of solidified being in New York. Kate and Mayor Bloomberg were part of a big event we had after that Creative New York report, and I distinctly remember folks like the publisher of Time Inc. and a couple other people, I think Barry Diller was on that panel, all saying that New York is one of the few places where we're able to attract talent. I remember Ann Moore from Time saying that basically it's London or New York. And for a lot of creative industries in New York, because of all the amenities, because of all the cultural attractions, because of all of the neighborhood-based amenities and opportunities for culture here, because of all the artistic people, this is the place where creative people want to be. And I think what Kate was saying and how the working artists and the nonprofit arts community are such a foundation for all of these other things that really have helped diversify the economy, that have helped be an engine for economic growth, even in some very hard times for New York and other places. So New York's been very lucky to have the creative economy. I think when I said it was complicated, I think that there's a lot of other things that have changed since 2005, since we did that last report, that are more problematic and challenging. So for instance, as the city continues to improve, it's gotten even harder for a lot of artists to be here. We've done a lot of interviews in our work, and some people will say it's really hard for emerging artists to come here these days. And we hear both things. We hear that, for a lot of people, New York is still the place to be. We still have people coming here to do their art because there's no other place where you can be around so many people doing similar things. There's no other place where you have so many opportunities to do your art, to perform, to rehearse, to have audiences, to have markets. But at the same time, the cost of living, the cost of so many things in New York has continued to go through the roof, and I think that continues to be a major problem. And I think going forward, if there's one overarching issue, is just to really make sure that the foundation for our success in the larger creative economy, working artists and nonprofit arts groups are able to really continue to thrive and be here.
Let me continue that theme, Elizabeth. In your book, The Warhol Economy, which you published in 2007, you talk about 2007 being a critical juncture in New York City's history in terms of the creative economy. And you say, and I'm quoting, "The very means by which the creative economy operates is being challenged significantly." What led you to that conclusion in 2007? Have things changed? Throughout the book, one of the threads is a concern about threat, risk to New York's preeminence as a cultural and artistic site.
Well, I think, we've talked a little bit about this already, which is that the success is its own demise, right? So when you think about the origins of Bohemia, right, we have this romantic vision of it being, poor, starving artists. And if you look at the history of New York, that's the case. But that's when we had places like Soho, where you had abandoned loft space, and you had Williamsburg when it was, really was not a place that was desirable, and that has rapidly shifted in New York City. And I think in 2007, the reason I thought about this was that New York was, already on the way to being a gilded city, and Manhattan in particular. And it became impossible when I talked to artists and designers. It became impossible for them to actually live here. They couldn't pay their rents. That density, that kind of magic that occurs when all of these artists and designers and musicians are living together was not working anymore, because they were all trying to figure out a way to, pay rent in Queens or in Brooklyn, and they weren't living in the same neighborhoods or 2 blocks down from one another. And so the problem is that we have, and to extent this is still a real challenge for the city. We had a lot of incredibly successful creative people, but the next generation, it was unsure how they were going to make it, because it was impossible for them to actually set up shop to even do so. And yet the most resounding finding in my work was that the social life of creative people is essential to their economic outcomes. And so if we strip them of that, then they really might as well be somewhere else, because they weren't getting that special fusion of, the people who ran the art world and, the magic of Fashion Week and the ability to hang out with people till 3 a.m. and talk about ideas. If that disappeared, then the essentialism of New York would disappear.
Well, you began that book by talking about CBGBs.
Yes, exactly.
The notion of CBGBs opening in Vegas was always something that seemed to me as an impossible thing to entertain. But apropos CBGBs, and to return to Jonathan on this, I mean, one of Patti Smith's most quoted lines is, "New York doesn't exist any longer. City's been taken from you. If you're a young artist, go somewhere else." And I'm never sure where somewhere else is, but that's a theme that plays out in both your 2005 and 2010 report, Jonathan, in which there is this sense that the city is no longer welcoming or open to the young and the struggling, to use your term, that the what I think, again, you talk about a critical mass of culture where the bars and the clubs and so forth and so on that nurture this cross-fertilization don't exist. You still think that's true at this point? I mean, the 2010 report was written in the sense of there's all of this vacant space and perhaps we can turn it to artistic purposes. How serious do you take that concern as we sit here in 2013?
You know, I think it's the biggest concern. I think it's always the biggest concern for arts in New York. I think it was probably a concern in the 60s and before that. I think that somehow, New York has weathered this for the most part. I think what's different now, and what we tried to say in that 2005 report, is that, for a long time, in the 70s and the 80s, there wasn't a lot of competition for New York when it came to the arts. And in the last 10, 15 years, I think a lot of other cities have become much more appealing to artistic people, to creative people. I think a lot of other cities have a creative economy today. And so I think there are more options for people. You don't just have to be in New York to be an artist today. You don't have to be in New York to be in the creative economy. And so that's something that New York has to reckon with. I think that there have been some great policies under the Bloomberg administration, both with the for-profit creative industries and for the nonprofit arts community, that have been really helpful. Things like SpaceWorks was just trying to address some of the space challenges. But undoubtedly, I think there's a real question as to whether New York is able to continue to attract the young and I forgot what you said, but the young and the struggling. I think, Lena Dunham famously said a few weeks ago that, rising rents are going to make all of the kind of artistic people in New York move to Tampa. There's, Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia. We hear it all the time that artists have other options and some of them are leaving. But I also feel like some people think that if artists can't be in Manhattan, then we've lost the game. And I don't believe that. And I think that we've seen, amazing changes, I think, for the positive in a lot of neighborhoods across New York City. And it always changes every year. In the last few years, in the last few months, there's been an article in the Times about Ridgewood, being a place. And, when the Times writes about it, it's always about 2 or maybe 5 years behind, there's always something else. Sunset Park, obviously Bushwick for a number of years. And I think that artists have been able to find those places where they can build the communities together and where they have spaces. But it continues to be a big problem. Also with the music venues like CBGB's. I mean, the disappearance of some of those great New York venues is a real tragedy in a lot of ways. At the same time, I was just walking around Williamsburg last week, and to see the number of music venues that have come up there in recent years is astounding. And it's just like things move. I think there's still this fundamental problem that I think the next mayor is going to continue to have to address. We do really have this big problem about affordability when it comes to places to work, places to live, and if there is one threat to all this, that continues to be it.
Kate, let me go back to something you said a minute ago, and please talk to each other too. I don't mean to suggest this is interview time, but you talked about the need to nuance creative economy, and it's become a term that sort of embraces all things, and when that happens, it generally embraces nothing. What about the overlap between knowledge economy, creative economy, particularly around the question of technology? I mean, one of the remarks that Barry Diller made in that conference that you just referred to was that New York needed to be more wired for his industry to function in the way that it might. What's the connection between efforts that have been placed by the mayor and others toward developing New York's technology sector and that connection to what we think of as arts and culture?
I mean, I guess I would pinpoint it as being, part of this question about content, and it ramifies in a couple of ways. Most practically, a concern about an under-nuanced understanding of the creative economy is that you have computer programmers and contemporary dancers in the same bucket.
Sure.
And they're pretty different in terms of their needs and the challenges they face. You can probably enumerate the number of computer programmers, and they probably all have health insurance, and the same is not true of the dancer folks. And it's actually, I mean, as a side note, one of the interesting challenges I face as an advocate is trying to represent the number of people who are artists in New York, because they're not captured reliably by census data. And I've had a lot of fun with my wonderful colleagues at the Department of City Planning's Demographics Office, because when you look at what you get on the US Census form, artist is in there with, I think, weather forecaster and, graphic designer.
Right.
So trying to pull those stats is pretty interesting. And furthermore, most artists I know will say, I check the box based on how pissed I am at whoever has written out my 1099.
Yeah.
So if I'm in a good mood, I'm a paralegal, and if, work didn't go so well, I'm an artist.
Yeah.
So, there are all kinds of complexities about a certain end of that spectrum. So I think overall, though, the knowledge economy is inextricably linked. It's just that there's one end of it that gets the credit for a certain amount of actual revenue. And I think the problem in general with economic-based models is that they don't give credit to the way in which ideas are catalyzed. And I mean, one of my favorite analogies for nonprofit culture is nuclear fusion. You can't actually see the atom smashing, but you can count the byproducts, and that's how you know it's happened. Yeah. And I think, that's actually pretty accurate when it comes to the actual direct impact of culture. Yeah. You don't feel it. The way you can start to calculate it, though, is the number of parking lots that are open later, the dry cleaners, the incidental so-called impacts are the things you can enumerate. Until our social science improves to the point where we can start capturing some more of that primary impact, it's going to be harder to credit the influence of culture on technology.
Yeah. Do you think the Roosevelt Island, Cornell Technicon investments in technology are going to have an impact on what we've been talking tonight, more traditionally thought about as arts and culture? Jonathan, I know you follow these things quite closely.
Well, I actually want to take a step back, if I may,
Please.
and say that, I think that there's this great connection between what's happening in the tech sector and what kind of arts and culture laid the groundwork for, because we just did a big study last year called New Tech City. It was all about kind of the startup community that's been growing in New York. And if you look at where it's growing, and first of all, it's been phenomenal, this rise of the tech sector in New York, all these tech startups. And it's happening in Union Square, it's happening in Dumbo, it's happening in the Meatpacking District. It's not happening in Midtown. It's happening to a lesser extent in downtown, and although that's changing. And I think that these are creative places that tech companies are drawn to. They want to be near each other, but they also want to be in creative places. And I think that, if you look at Dumbo, it was really the kind of, artists and then the music companies that started to go there, and designers, and then tech companies said, wow, that's cool, and there's spaces that we like, but yes, it was also kind of cool and interesting. In Union Square, tech companies are there, it's the biggest center of tech right now, but before the tech companies were there, they wanted to be near the fashion designers. They wanted to be near the music companies in Union Square, and they wanted to be able to run into people. And I think that's really important, and I think very few people make that connection in economic development. And I've heard so many people, as we did research about the differences between like Silicon Valley and New York City and the tech area, and so many people say that, well, these days, there's changes in technology where, it's not all about engineering. So much in technology today is about things like design and content, and New York has that in spades, and it's one reason why we're doing well. I just think that, creativity is at the heart of what's going. I remember some people were telling me that, these days, if you don't have to be in the middle of Silicon Valley, out on what is a parking lot, wouldn't you, if you were in your 20s or early 30s, want to be in New York City? And I think part of that is the kind of creative vibe that's been developed in New York, and it's attracted those tech people.
Well, this is part of the point you've made about the difference between 128 and Silicon Valley. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, I was thinking about it when Jonathan was talking, because of course Silicon Valley's historical roots are quite bohemian. I mean, those young guys out there, starting companies in their garages were actually, young bohemian guys. They were a part of that counterculture, and so I think that, and Kate pointing out to how difficult it is to put your finger on it, but there is this co-location of creativity. And if you look throughout history, that's the case. Even broadly drawn, if we think about the co-location of finance and the art market, that there are moments in time where particular places are incredibly important for innovation and knowledge. And what's interesting now, I think, more so, and Jonathan talked about this idea that creative, innovative people want to be around creative, innovative people, and they don't all have to have PhDs in computer science. They want to be around artists and musicians, and they have the same strange hours, and there's a whole kind of milieu in which they engage. But the thing that's really interesting now is the extent to which artistic skills bleed into other industries in a meaningful way. So it's not, one of the great things about New York now is, we always will have art for art's sake, and then we'll have the booming art market, which is still very, very elite. But now what you're seeing is, whether you're talking about the technological skills that artists develop themselves, the programs that they use, or the apps, the rise of the video game industry, that artistic skills are now really are symbiotically linked to technology in a real way, that I think it takes it to a whole new level when you have both those skill sets co-locating.
Yeah, I think that's so. The collaborative nature of things, Kate, in terms of real estate, the older economy, development in the city, urban planning, and the importance of the creative and the cultural in that space. And a lot of discussion about Hudson Yards. I realize things are still in a fluid state there around Artshed, but can you talk a little bit about the experience you've had in forming partnerships in terms of development, urban planning, and the role that arts and culture play in that exercise, the space that they can occupy simultaneously, collaboratively?
Well, one of the many ways in which my agency is unique is that everything we do is in partnership with the private sector. Not only does culture not have a great track record in this country of telling artists what to do, but the New York, as the largest individual arts funder in the U.S., comes out of a tradition of the private sector coming to the city saying, would you respond to a need? Our first genetically engineered cultural institution in 1869 was a product of private citizens coming to the city and said, if we create a collection, will you build a building? And that was the Museum of Natural History. Yep. So there happens to be a long, I would say, relatively functional, given the overall friction between government and the arts, relationship that is public and private. We've worked in a couple of different directions, and not only is the mayor supremely supportive, but our economic development brethren and our current deputy mayor Bob Steele very much recognizes a lot of what Jonathan was saying. Even you can't yet prove it, but it's very much the case that the appeal in so many traditional economic development sectors of arts and creativity is increasingly manifest. So we've done a fair amount of work with putting cultural institutions into commercial developments. Yep. Jazz at Lincoln Center is one of them. We have 3 theaters going into commercial residential development on the far west side of Manhattan, the new Signature Center on 42nd Street, a number of projects now in Brooklyn. And it's very interesting to try and work with commercial real estate developers and figure out how to operationally defend, protect, and enable those projects to go forward. But what's interesting is developers want them. And it was very striking to me in doing a major rezoning in Harlem, the deal closer was a land use issue around trying to create incentives for arts and culture in commercial developments. So, developers want it, they're just not sure exactly how to feed and care for the beast. So, that's one advanced form, I would say, or evolved form of public-private partnership. But a lot of what we've done also is try and work with our private sector nonprofit partners in, again, effecting a 5-borough strategy, figuring out what are the right kinds of investments. Ended up doing a lot of work with financial institutions around financing for these kind of projects. And in other words, there's a whole range of collaboration that needs to take place. Some of the major projects, not directly under the purview of my agency, but the revivification of Governor's Island or the creation of Brooklyn Bridge Park have also been done very much with cultural programming at the core of the strategy to create identity for those projects. So that it's another way in which there are lots of different kinds of partnerships. What we've tried to do with the agency is not only position ourselves as skilled intermediaries in a lot of these ways, because you gotta preserve and respect the sovereignty of the content. And if you start trying to poke at it and tell it to move 3 feet over, do it in blue instead of green, it's just not the appropriate role of government. But what you can figure out how to do is, again, isolate and protect the core dynamics and then shape a framework around it that will help these organizations survive and thrive.
That's beautifully said. I'm particularly struck by your reference to 1869. I mean, both sides of the park, both the Metropolitan that follows and the Museum of Natural History, are overdetermined in their establishment. But the role that they played in developing Central Park, the movement of the zoo to the Bronx, to make all of that is again about recognizing the economic impact, the real estate impact in that case of cultural institutions like that. So this is nothing that the city hasn't had experience with, but it's remarkable to see it come full circle in that way. Jonathan, on the question of the appropriate role of government that Kate just noted in the arts and in establishing these partnerships, what's your take on that? I mean, again, this is something that you have addressed in a variety of ways, the delicate balance between securing the private and promoting the public, the role of government. In one of your conferences, Elizabeth Currid, the great choreographer, saw this as an absolute death wish for the arts to be involved in any kind of government activity, that you needed to be subversive, you needed to find your own way, and that the individual artist, the lone wolf artist, was what drove arts and culture in the city. How do you see that balance that Kate was just talking about?
I think it is a balance, but I think there's no doubt that there's a market failure out there, or there's a fundamental problem when it comes to the space issue. The price points that artists or a lot of arts groups can afford, the market's just not providing that. And I think that that's where the government has to come in. I think it should come in and work with building owners, with developers where it's possible. So like, here's a couple of suggestions that we've made over the years, I think, where there's still some opportunity. A lot of people talk about building new spaces for the arts, and there's opportunities to think about that going forward. But one thing that I think the city could do a little more of is Class B and C buildings. To me, Class B and C buildings are so critical for the arts, for nonprofits, for creative industries, because they're older, they're more affordable, and they tend to be where a lot of creative people end up migrating to do work. And the problem is that there's fewer and fewer of them. I really like to call them kind of natural incubators. But I think that more could be done to preserve the Class B and C spaces that we have in New York City. We don't have to say that this space or that space has to be just for the arts, but I think it's in the interest of the city to say, let's make sure there are enough of these affordable spaces that have proven to be so important for growing creative industries, so important for the arts. So I think that's one thing. I think we ought to look at other innovative space opportunities out there where the government might play a role. So we've written a little bit in the past about second floor retail spaces. In so many retail districts around New York City, you find really successful ground floor retail, but then you have empty second or third floor retail. In some of those cases, there may be opportunities to think about things interestingly for the arts. Not all of them, but some of them where landlords are making so much with the ground floor retail tenant, they don't have any incentive to really think about, well, I don't even need a tenant upstairs. I don't need to put any money into the upstairs. But there might be some things where incentives are involved where the landlord, if the incentive is right, might make something available at a fairly decent price for some arts organization or working artists or something like that. I think that there have been some really important programs when it comes to temporary spaces for the artists.
Like an Anita Durst's program? Or?
Like what Anita has done with Shishama, and there's a number of those kind of programs around the city. But they're at a fairly small scale. I think they could be expanded. I think that incentives for building owners to participate in some of those things might be helpful. There's a few other space issues that I think that you could talk about. I mean, the third rail when it comes to this is often residential spaces for the artists, and one of the challenges there is that why single out people in the arts for subsidized housing or discounted housing, because nurses and teachers and police officers and others have similar challenges with affordability in New York. So why would you create spaces for the arts? But I do think that that has to be thought of, given how important the arts are for the city's future. And I'd love the city to think about, could the arts be included in parts of the city where not enough development is happening right now, where maybe putting in an arts component, putting in some incentives might allow for development. So for instance, we're doing a totally different study right now. It's not really arts focused, although there is going to be some look at that, about the future of Queens. It's a really fun project. As we looked at downtown Jamaica, there's a lot of challenges with downtown Jamaica. Downtown Jamaica has not had a lot of new housing development. I think it could benefit from some new housing development. It may be that we decide that that's one area where maybe there's an arts component to some kind of a major affordable housing or middle-class housing development that goes on there. It's something just to think about. And then finally, I just wanted to say that I think that there's art-specific solutions I think the next mayor and the city could be thinking about, but then there's other just very basic things, because artists have the same kind of quality of life issues as so many other people. And if you look at the geography of the arts in New York right now, there's much fewer of them living in Manhattan. So many more of the artists and creative people are in the boroughs outside of Manhattan, but that creates issues, for instance, with transportation. So let's say you have a dancer living in Bushwick, but maybe they have a job, their day job, where they're making money up in Harlem at some arts organization. Maybe they have to get to auditions in Times Square. Maybe they have a gig in Brooklyn. We've got to greatly improve our transit system outside of Manhattan. And artists could greatly benefit from that. In fact, when I read some of the recent articles about how artists have moved to Ridgewood in Queens, one of the things that people have cited for the kind of upsurge there is that the city in 2010 changed the M line so that it was fewer stops and a lot faster to get out to Ridgewood. That's had an impact, apparently. It's not the only reason. So, something as mundane as transit could, I think, benefit folks in the arts.
How tractable is the space problem, Kate? I mean, every report that I've read, you talk about it as well, Elizabeth. Can we solve this? Can we make progress? You've made progress, obviously, but will it always be the case that housing is a roadblock to the young and the struggling participating in the innovative press of the arts and culture communities? What can be done? Anything, or is this a problem we'll be complaining about 30 years from now?
I think what both Elizabeth and Jonathan have said or implied, your strengths are your weaknesses. As long as the city's economy is relatively healthy, there are going to be financial pressures. And unlike cities like Detroit or St. Louis, we don't have a large decaying inner city, or Cleveland that you can use to repurpose for artists. So on the one hand, it's a sign of fiscal health that there is a certain amount of pressure here. And as long as I can remember, the issue of affordability has been a problem and a concern for artists. And another thing Elizabeth Streb likes to say is artists are bottom feeders. If you have to make the work, you have to be a barracuda and figure it out. The question is how hard becomes too hard. And speaking to some of the suggestions Jonathan was making, I think they're all valid. The concern in general as we've experienced it, is that not all arts organizations are prepared to own their own real estate, and ultimately actually should not necessarily be encouraged to. What you really want to focus on, again, is what's the mission, how do you drive content, and get less wrapped up in, you know, sort of a particular kind of organizational infrastructure that may ultimately topple of its own weight. So we focused on building a certain amount of venues. We've tried to focus on prioritizing venues that do build rehearsal and studio space in them, and they've been very successful. And then the entity that Jonathan mentioned, Spaceworks, is a nonprofit real estate development firm that we have incubated and spun off, and its sole purpose is to create workspace for artists. Because after taking a long look at, you know, we can't do housing because you can't discriminate on the basis of employment as the government, and the private sector isn't, you know, unlike the teachers or the police, artists don't have a pension system that's there to finance preferential housing. But artists do have a unique workspace problem, and, you know, we've taken a long look at this over a number of years, and what really finally, you know, blew my mind was the folks at Manhattan Mini Storage bragging about how many artists were renting their units to make work, which is, you know, unsafe, illegal, and fundamentally creepy. So
all of the above.
We've been working towards, you know, a kind of second mortgage strategy to help people, to help artists buy property, and the numbers just never worked. But what we finally realized was a real estate intermediary that could subdivide, hold, manage, ensure the affordability of workspace for, you know, performing artists and then for visual artists could actually make a real contribution. Because what Anita Durst has done, what the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council's done, what the Brooklyn Arts Council has done in terms of temporary space is extraordinary. But what you really start seeing, or where you really start seeing the benefits of artists transforming communities, is in more permanent, affordable space. So part of what Spaceworks is set up to do is work opportunistically. We have a couple of great projects that we're working in Brooklyn Public Library branches that have excess space, but we also have a couple of straight commercial leases that we're working on. And, you know, the hope is over time, if this model functions the way we think it will, it's not that there aren't relatively affordable parcels of space artists would be interested in. It's that they come in 20,000 square foot chunks that individual artists aren't prepared to take on. So by having this kind of intermediary, our thought is that this may be one way of making a more tractable run at providing the space where artists can make work that isn't about a residence, it's not about an award, it's about if you can prove you're a working artist, here are the keys, go do it.
Terrific. Apropos the boroughs we've been talking about, and following on this question about arts communities beginning to emerge in Class B and Class C buildings, what's it take, Elizabeth, in your research to constitute the critical mass in a new site to create this as an artistic space, as a welcoming center for artists and cultural workers?
Well, I'm going to use a historical example since we're talking about zoning and how the government could facilitate artistic communities. In the 1960s, Soho was massively deindustrialized, and, you know, all the light manufacturing had left, and much of it had also left because of the fear that Robert Moses was going to build a big old expressway down into Soho, and, you know, might as well get out before the construction began. And what happened then is that there were all these abandoned loft spaces, and these artists started squatting. And it was great space if you think about the actual aesthetic of the art at the time, which was that, you know, we're dealing with the tail end of abstract expressionism, and if you look at the size of art over time, it gets bigger and bigger. So this was actually, this kind of space really lent itself to what was going on. And the city was faced with a conundrum, which was, you know, do we boot these people out? You know, there's a fire safety issue, they shouldn't be here, or do we figure out a way to facilitate them because these buildings aren't being used for manufacturing anymore? And in 1971, the Department of City Planning rezoned it and said, you can live and work here. Okay, we've rezoned it so you can do both. And what happened after that was you had a trickle in of bars, you had a trickle in of galleries that were very interested in these artists. They started representing the artists. You know, you fast forward even 20 years, and now you have a Chanel on the corner of, I think it's Worcester. And so you see how the arts really, the evolution of this city to planning decision really changed a neighborhood. And certainly for a hot minute, it worked for the artists, right? I mean, now I think you'd be hard pressed to find young artists in Soho. But what really happened there is that the city enabled them to form the community they wanted. The next thing I want to talk about is the garment district in Midtown Manhattan. So in 1987, it was zoned to protect the manufacturers, right? And it remains really, really important for designers all around the region. My colleague Sarah Williams at MIT and I just finished a big study tracking how designers use the district. And it turns out it's not just those who are located within the district, it's also designers who are way outside, who are taking trains from Queens or from Brooklyn, they're coming in and they're doing their work. These examples are to illuminate the way in which so many artistic communities tend to be ad hoc, and they need all the stuff in the same place. So in many ways, Manhattan is great because it has this inelastic geography, right? It all does have to happen in the same place. And so if you live in Brooklyn or Queens, you can at least, get on the train and you're here to do all the stuff you need to do in the same place. And that is, I think, the thing we've been talking about and hinting at, which is that possible now to create those kind of artistic communities? Because I think to extend the conversation again to technology, if you look historically at a place like Silicon Valley, it's the same trope. I mean, it's the same, they all hung out together, they all went to the same bars, they ate at Denny's at 3 in the morning, they talked about technology ideas, they collaborated, they were down the street from one another, so if the electricity went off, their friend would let them use it, would let them do work in their office, and artists do the same thing. And so I think that density and that ability to ad hoc be creative is critical to art and the creative economy more generally. And that sounds kind of broad, but it actually has some key components. So it has really skilled human capital. It has the kinds of social spaces in which they can interact so that they're not in these, towers and these kind of vacuums where they're just working on their own, that they are almost forced to organically, that they go out on the street and they run into people, that they go to the same places to buy coffee or to eat dinner. And then that there is this professional component, right, which is that there's the associations that enable them to, actually do work together, right? So it's not just that they, had lunch or dinner together, but that they actually then meet in an association. And I think that New York's creative economy over time and, technology clusters like Silicon Valley have exhibited those exact same traits. So that's what I really think is going on.
Terrific. I have to ask this since we are at the Graduate Center. What role do universities play in the creative economy, in the knowledge economy that we're talking about? How do universities become partners in this nexus we've been discussing this evening? How can they do a better job to advance these causes? Kate, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think universities have a huge role to play, particularly because universities have long been the sort of affirmer of value in a really meaningful way for a population of individuals at a critical age. And I think one of the problems that arts and culture have suffered is that they're seen as extraneous or extra. I mean, if you look at the position of fine arts departments in most universities, they're kind of on the fringes. There aren't too many provosts who have ever come from, that kind of world. The fact that you're an English professor, that's pretty cool. Stepping out with the humanities, man. But, move it over into the fine arts, you're really kind of suffering. So I think, there is a huge role to play in positioning this as a meaningful discourse that has real teeth, that isn't just about questions of taste, but that has a body of real information and interest behind it. And the fact that you're devoting a full year to a series of conversations around this topic by itself is, I think, an assertion of seriousness. But I think there are, in all the other ways that universities subtly telegraph what's valuable, whether it's credits to degree or it's various kinds of embrace and encouragement to really take certain kinds of things seriously. The final thing I'll say is I think universities, practically speaking, have a huge role to play, because I do believe in my advocate's role that there is a major terrain that's missing, and Elizabeth and Jonathan in their own disciplines have worked to fill this, but it's around being able to talk about and capture the value of arts and culture. I think it tends to fragment, in a way, economic impact is the low-hanging fruit, but that doesn't capture the actual value, and ironically, it sometimes works against it. The number of butts and seats is no guarantee of the actual creative value of the work being seen, and we have a long history of some of the most influential work having gone completely unappreciated during the lifetime of the artist or artists creating that. But so I think there is, whether it's a sort of Howard Gardner theory of multiple intelligences that applies to art, or there's a whole world of criminology that talks about collective efficacy in ways that I think are interesting, because they speak to this notion of an impact that, broken down to its component parts may seem a little magical, but it actually has a measurable impact. How you start quantifying things in ways that don't fall into the kinds of patterns that will always make art and culture appear secondary, but really, start in the same way that we're doing in neuroscience. There are all kinds of powerful combinations of disciplinary thinking. I think there's a real opportunity for intense intellectual collaboration to create some paradigms that I think will be much more accurate and nuanced around this whole field.
Certainly what we're trying to do here. Jonathan?
Well, I think that one thing that comes to mind is we did a study a couple years ago about the role of design universities in New York's economy, and New York graduates more than twice as many designers and architects as any other city in the US, and that's important. Those designers that come to FIT, that come to Parsons, that come to Pratt, so many other institutions here, they stay here. They stay here, they become designers at architectural firms in the city, and that's really important. I think you see that in places like film, at the film schools in New York and in other disciplines, and that's critical. I think that I don't see enough of universities in the city really being kind of an intimate part of the kind of growth of creative industries. I think that when you look at other cities, and so many other cities in the last 10 years have really tried to develop art strategies, right? They're trying to build their own creative economies. And you often see a university at the heart of those things, or a big part of them. And I haven't really seen that, and maybe because it didn't have to happen that way. We had our own creative industry. We didn't need the university to be the big, kind of pillar to make a difference. I do think, though, just the way Kate was talking about how with SpaceWorks and other initiatives, that there's a move to look at libraries and using their spaces after hours. We have these universities across the city, not just CUNY, but obviously there's so many CUNY institutions, but so many others that are in neighborhoods. And I just wonder, are there unused, and I know that you guys are, expanding like crazy. I know there's record enrollment at much of CUNY, and so I don't imagine there's a lot of spaces in the university that are empty, but I think that universities should look to see if there are ways that they can help address some of the space challenges.
Yeah. Last question. What advice do you give the next mayor about ways of strengthening the cultural economy? I mean, these are huge shoes to fill. What advice, Elizabeth, would you offer to the next mayor about advancing, protecting, enhancing the economy that centers around arts and culture?
I think we need to get back to it being more democratic. I think New York, like London, is a city that recovered massively and then some with regards to the recession. It's a city which has a real estate market that is impossible for anyone who is not, top 1% doesn't even capture it. That doesn't get you far in the island of Manhattan. And that really does mean that young people can't make it here. And, we can argue that, the New York region has space. But to actually create the kinds of exciting, energetic communities that produce great, not artists, great movements, because art isn't about individuals, art is about a huge collective spirit of things happening all at once. I mean, this is Patti Smith's New York. And this is the abstract expressionists. This is Andy Warhol's world. That kind of collective dynamic can't exist, in a particular place right now. So, how do we do that? And I don't think it is, well, we've got to, find that tiny little space on Manhattan where these, young artists can be, because I'm not sure if that's realistic. But I do think we need to find a place for them in Brooklyn. We have to find somewhere for them to do something. Seriously. And I think they've been outpriced there too. But I really do think we need to figure out a way in which we, find places where artists can live and concentrate and actually make it. Or in 20 years, New York may still be a fantastic financial center, but I don't think it will be necessarily breeding its own artists anymore.
Jonathan, you doubtless will be giving the new mayor lots of advice. What on this question would you suggest?
Well, New York still has an unemployment rate over 8%. So the next mayor is going to have to make economic growth, a real priority. But as I go back to what I started with at the beginning tonight, and that is what has been growing in our economy. We have begun to diversify the economy. We have to look to where the things that have been growing, and there are all these creative industries: film, advertising, fashion, tourism, so many other, design. And so much of this, though, and the thing that I would say to the next mayor is that so many of these industries that are growing today, the foundation is the working artists and nonprofit arts community. And I think that goes missing too often. And I hope that the next mayor could recognize that, because we do have to, as Elizabeth said, really kind of make sure that there's room for those folks. We often forget this kind of pillar at the bottom that makes all this, the rest of this happen. And there's got to be a place for the working artists. There's got to be a place for nonprofit arts groups. And I mentioned previously a few specific ideas. I'll be mentioning those again. But I think most importantly, they've really got to understand how pivotal the working artists and the nonprofit arts groups are to the larger economy today.
Kate, let me modify the question. What are you going to tell your successor, other than this is a very, very hard act to follow? What would you say?
There's the bathroom. Go for it.
I would not presume to give advice unless specifically asked. But I do think what is critical is to be mindful of the ways in which government and the arts have an innate misalignment, and it's one that can make it difficult to figure out how to properly serve, have patience with, recognize the kind of value Jonathan and Elizabeth were talking about in this sector. And that's to say that usually what government's good at is responding to collective need. If everybody runs to one side of the boat, you can see it, you feel it, you pay attention to it. What artists and arts organizations tend to want from government is to be given money and left alone and not asked for any deliverable and to have no accountability and produce something whenever they feel like it. And more power to them, but it's not what government does well. Government's in the business of delivering standardized services that can be enumerated. And it's one of the great advocacy challenges. My colleagues, Department of Health, can tell you for $10 how many TB patches he can distribute. I can't give you a deliverable, and we wouldn't want me to. We wouldn't want to all know that we're teaching pointillism at 4 o'clock on Thursdays everywhere. So if you recognize that this is, again, a fundamental misalignment, there is nonetheless an enormous role, I think, for government to be productive in this sphere. Similarly, though, I think the creative community, the arts community, has to understand in working with government, what is the role of government, what is the potential of government, and how to ask for, what it is possible to receive to create a really robust public-private partnership, because otherwise, it's too easy for both sides to get really frustrated and miss out on the potential opportunities for valuable collaboration.
My friends, please thank these extraordinary panelists.